Here, read this.
Woof.
Hello and welcome back to the grounds of Toad Hall, or as it's known in Smelly Old Reality, the Hermitage of Braid in Edinburgh. Smelly Old Reality will be very much a theme of today's video on 5 takeaways from Chapter 5 of The Wind in the Willows. In this chapter, Dulce Domum, we follow Ratty and Mole as they visit a human village, and then Mole's old home after Mole gets a tantalizing sniff of it and has to follow his nose and check on his old abode that we saw in the first chapter. As with the previous videos, I'm not so much recapping the chapter as just sharing my 5 favourite bits, 5 points of interest. But I might just start on a word on the chapter title itself, Dulce Domum. I'm not a Latinist, so please pick me up on this if I've got it wrong, but from what I can find out, this is commonly translated as Home Sweet Home, but I'm not sure if that is derived from its presence in a Latin hymn, which goes Domum, Domum, Dulce Domum, which sounds a little bit more like the repetitions you find in the phrase Home Sweet Home. Elsewhere, it's translated as Sweetly Homeward, which seems very fitting for the action of this chapter. But whatever the correct definition, I think you get the sentiment. It's also a chapter title in Walter Scott's Waverley. Graham was a great fan of Walter Scott and lived for the first few months of his life only a few doors away from where Scott had lived in Edinburgh, on Castle Street. And he was a lifelong fan of Scott, and in fact, when he died, it was with a copy of the Talisman in his hands. So on to takeaway number 1. We join Ratty and Mole on the road, almost as if the action is continued directly on from the previous chapter. However, it becomes obvious that some time has elapsed since then. But they're not at home, they're travelling, and they come across a human habitation, a village. They're walking along a road which is described as wet, well-metalled, meaning that it has borne the impression of many metal vehicles passing over it, like well-trod. And I think given the all-pervading nostalgia in Wind in the Willows, the sort of harking back to a golden age, I think we're meant to perceive it something of a flinch when we hear a phrase like well-metalled road. There is the ring of the Iron Age about it, of a unlikable and fallen modernity. So we come to a village, and Mole and Rat, with some trepidation, peer into windows. We have more of Ratty's euphemisms about the possible danger that they are facing. He talks about how, at this time of day they'll be safely in their houses and we won't have any bother or trouble from men, women, cats and dogs. His language sounding like there might be a bit of an unpleasant scene, but is he actually referring to being killed, being trapped, being tore apart by a dog? It's always kind of impossible to tell with Ratty how much he's playing down or how much Graham is letting us know about how this society intermingles. And finally, we see another bird cage through one of these windows, another imprisoned animal. No obvious distinction between the birds that they encounter in the wild, but every time we see a bird imprisoned, we get the impression from the animal's response that this is some kind of lower order of animal. It'd be interesting to see if the cats and dogs would be the same. Would they be like the horse that we saw earlier in the chapter on the open road, who can speak but also seems more enthralled to his natural impulses, more like a wild animal barely tamed than Mr. Mole and Mr. Badger, or Mr. Ladybird, who has just crept onto my notebook there. Yeah, and it seems to say something about Ratty and Moley, that when they look at this bird, they don't feel outrage at its imprisonment. It makes them feel homesick. It seems to make them feel jealous of its comfort. Point number 2 relates to the summons. For the second time, Mole is seized with a unnameable thrill. We saw this in the first chapter, obviously, when he suddenly gives up whitewashing and charges for the surface and bursts into a glorious spring, filled memorably with the carols of birds. Here he has another thrill, which, sorry, I'm just checking that this ladybird isn't going to get crushed by my weighty prose. Yes, Mole is walking along and then is gripped as if by a telegraphic current. It seems like Graham uses the unimaginable aspects of an animal's power of scent, something that humans cannot possibly imagine having, as a kind of stand-in for a spiritual summons. Also unknowable, also perhaps impossible to put into words, although we will see him have another go at that in the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, of course. Oh, he's off. Graham certainly did have a respect for smell. He said in his journals that a change of smells is as cheering as a change of air. But we know that what seizes Mole is more than merely scent, because when Ratty touches Mole's arm, he feels its charge running through him. almost like it really is a telegraphic current, which is an interesting choice of simile because telegraphic technology was already somewhat outdated. It's already quite a nostalgic technology to be looking back on for Graham. We spoke in a previous video about how the memory of Tennyson loomed over this period of English literature, but telegraphic currents were around in Tennyson's day. He spoke of hearing them wailing over his head like the souls of dead messages. And there is a whiff of the mausoleum about Willows. A lot of the nostalgia, a lot of the yearning, a lot of the sudden outbreaks of inarticulable emotion seem to indicate the sense of a collective loss or wound. On to takeaway number 3. This is a strange one, and we touched on this, I think, in the last chapter, and it's the agency that Graham ascribes to things and places. He makes places and objects have a very particular kind of emotional grip on the characters. And it's not the emotion felt by the characters for the things, but the demanding emotions that the things inflict on the characters. So with the smell of Molly's home, his home sort of reproaches him. It runs out to him, delighted to see him, but resentful at its abandonment. It's as if Mole's home and the objects in it have all the emotions of betrayed children. And what's really interesting about it in this chapter, in light of the emotional repression we've spoken about in the past, Ratty's reserve, his decision to not quite look at embarrassing moments, to turn a blind eye to open shows of emotion, and to strictly observe animal etiquette. With all that in mind, it's the emotion of these inanimate objects that travels up the food chain through the telegraphic current of Mole and finally reaching Rat via Mole's basically guilt-tripping him for not stopping and not listening to him when he said, I can smell something, or I don't quite know what it is. And in fairness to Rat, I feel like I've been quite hard on Rat in these videos. I've called him a bit of a hypocrite. I've accused him of dangerously resting on euphemism to give Mole a misleading impression of the relative danger or safety of the wild wood, and of fundamentally misreading Mr. Badger and Mr. Toad. But I think this chapter is Rat's finest hour. He throws himself into the mission to find Molly's home, and once they find it and it's full of dust and there aren't enough supplies, he just rolls up his sleeves, if he's wearing sleeves, and sets about making the best of things. And while we're singing the praises of Rat, let's just take a moment to consider how much he has done for Mole. You know, put him up, financially provided for him, been patient with Mole's ignorance and Mole's tempestuousness. Think of when he upturned the boat on the river in chapter 1. Emotionally and materially indulged him, even when it meant taking him away from the thing he loves above all, his river. Okay, on to point number 4, which is Mole's interior decorating. Little did we know back in chapter 1, when all we heard of Mole End was its darkness, its gloom, and the fact that Mole was applying some whitewash, quite how elaborate and bizarre his inner furnishings were. And not just the furnishings, but the layout itself. So the first thing we meet in Mole's underground lair, which if you remember was described as modest and small, is a forecourt decorated with plaster statuaries of Queen Victoria, the infant Samuel, and other heroes of modern Italy. To the side of this is a skittle alley. We get a sense of Mole's bachelordom from the beer mug rings as well as the skittle alley. I remember reading somewhere that in an early draft of Willows there was a Mrs. Mole, but she was removed when she started causing complications. Perhaps it's her transferred spiritual emotions that are reaching out to Molly, asking why she has been abandoned, but they take the form of his stuff. I guess also, even though we'll have cross-dressing later on, Graham was keen, as we have seen, to be rid of the clash of sex, and Mrs. Mole might have introduced a whiff of that. I feel like every single one of these details we could spend an hour dissecting. The statuaries and other heroes of modern Italy, I love that phrase. The Gothic lettering of Mole End, I think that gives us a little insight again into Mole's tastes. We've talked in the past about how he's not an artist, but we do get a sense of his taste in things. And the fact that his tastes seem quite random and incoherent indicates that he might perhaps be someone who is at sea with his taste, who has maybe tried to impress a number of different friends, resulting in quite an incoherent mishmash of a forecourt. But of course, the standout detail, which we have already referred to, is the goldfish pond in the middle of the forecourt. I feel like I have to share with you that if you can hear that, what they're shouting at is a sausage dog who does not give a shit. He's got better things to do, mate. Arthur's following telegraphic currents of his own. My God. Yes, the standout feature of Mole End is the goldfish pond. We have already addressed the issue of whether or not the goldfish survived, or Graham has anyway, but I made a quick video about a letter he sent a concerned reader asking who fed the goldfish. What we didn't talk about is that in the middle of the goldfish pond is a fanciful erection topped with a large silvered ball that reflected everything all wrong and had a very pleasing effect. It's really hard not to imagine Graham just sort of messing with us at this point, but if we look at this fanciful erection with a straight face, it's sort of interesting that it presents a topsy-turvy picture of the world, since the world of Willows is very much a world that has gone topsy-turvy, where wild animals pride themselves on being civilized, even while human civilization continues to exist alongside them. And this silvered ball is another ornament of the confused nostalgia in Willows. These decorations were known as witch balls. It's a pagan relic that had been slowly domesticated into a fairly friendly good luck symbol. And it has been suggested that this is where we get Christmas baubles. And speaking of Christmas, that brings us to number 5, which is, of course, the Christmas carolers, the young field mice who appear at the door of Mole End and sing for Rat and Mole. Yet more theological implications for Wind in the Willows, as the field mice sing them a nativity carol, which features Mary and Joseph, but also takes the animals a little bit off the margins, gives them a bit more of a primary role in the nativity story, as I will read to you. And then they heard the angels tell, who were the first to cry Noel? Animals, all as it befell, in the stable where they did dwell, joy shall be theirs in the morning. First blush, this seems to be yet another contradiction. We will, of course, in a few chapters' time, meet a god, and it's not a Christian god. But I think it's worth mentioning that although Christmas is mentioned in the novel, it's not named in this chapter. There is mention of Yuletide and the field mice singing one of the old-time carols that their ancestors wrote in the fields and has trickled down into the villages, striking a somewhat secular note of traditional festivity and celebrations that isn't necessarily connected seriously to a religion. Not unlike having a gigantic silver ball in the middle of your goldfish pond, which can be traced back to ancient folk beliefs. So there you have it, 5 takeaways from Chapter 5 of Wind in the Willows. Tune in next time for 5 more takeaways on Chapter 6, where the hour shall come for Mr. Toad. But until then, happy reading.